start the walk now. Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Rees, and for those of you who don't know, I'm Professor of Places and City Planning at the Bartlett. And today we're trying something of an experiment. As you know, we're trying to adapt to COVID and to produce teaching that will be flexible and allow people to study wherever they are in the world, because I know a lot of you at the moment are spread around the globe, and some of you spread around London. And a few here with me in the centre of the City of London for what we're going to have as a Zoom walk today around the city. Now, to help me today, we've got a camera crew, and if I can just change my camera, you see we've got Axel, Werner and Vipa, who are our camera crew today, and they're going to be filming various aspects of our walk. Axel is going to be filming the paving that we're walking on so that we can see what the textures are beneath our feet. Vipa is going to be filming the skyline and showing us the tops of the buildings. No, it's Werner, isn't it, who's filming? You're filming the skyline. I keep getting this wrong. And Vipa is going to be filming me so you can see where I am, particularly in the walk, because my camera will now be turned on to pointing in exactly the direction that we're going, so you can see what I'm seeing. So we've got the 4 pictures up on the screen. Hopefully you can all hear me. Seems to be working here, the technology. We had a rehearsal last week, and in fact, it was quite exciting because in the middle of our rehearsal, 2 policemen on horseback turned up to find out what we were doing, because there'd been complaints from the Bank of England that there was a security threat. Anyway, it was quickly sorted out and we weren't actually in the cells. So having done the rehearsal last week, hopefully it'll go smoothly. We're going to spend an hour this morning walking through the City of London. Now, the City of London is a very unusual place. It's a world financial centre. It's a CBD for London. It has normally 500,000 people coming to work here every day, well over 90% of them coming by public transport. 6 to 8% are cycling or walking to work, and almost nobody drives a car in the City of London. But there are still vehicles, of course, buses, taxis, delivery vans, and the occasional car. And as a result of COVID, and indeed already before COVID, the city has been taking steps to try to reduce traffic in the city. So we're now going to walk a little down towards the main junction in the city and see what's been happening in terms of traffic. So here we go on our walk. You'll notice in this part of the city rather, that the buildings that surround us are all buildings from the late 19th and early 20th century. And these are buildings that are palaces of finance. Buildings that were built by the major banks to house their staff where they could carry out their transactions of global finance. And on the opposite side of this busy road junction ahead of me, you will see a building with columns on the front, very grand building, and that's the Mansion House where the Lord Mayor lives. That's the Lord Mayor of the City of London, not the Mayor of Greater London. This is the mayor, the predecessor of whom was Dick Whittington, the famous children's story. There actually was a Dick Whittington, and he was mayor of the City of London. All of the other surrounding buildings are bank buildings. We have the Bank of England, the centre of British finance. We have the Royal Exchange. Behind the Royal Exchange, some tall buildings from the 21st century, the cluster of office towers, and that's where we'll be ending up at the end of this 1-hour walk. But you can see where we are at the moment, very much a Victorian city. And the Victorians were great engineers. They introduced new roads, railways, and other services into the city. And in terms of the centre of the business district, they wanted to be able to get horse-drawn carriages in more easily. So they built extra roads leading into the centre of the city. 3 extra roads added into this junction, making a total of 7 roads meeting at this one point in the city. Well, of course, this was a recipe for chaos and disaster. And it's only in recent years that it's been possible for the city municipality, the Corporation of London, to take most of the traffic out of this junction. And even without COVID, you would see today a junction here with only a few buses and necessary service vehicles allowed through, the space handed over almost entirely to pedestrians and cyclists. That produces a city that's much better for walking in, much more friendly for people to work here. The environment is greatly improved. The quality of the air is much better. And as you see, apart from the occasional bus going through the junction, all is very peaceful. Even at the end of the 19th century, this junction was so congested with horse-drawn traffic that people were suggesting building pedestrian bridges over the top of it. Well, this is the quietest it's ever been, and COVID, of course, is only making it all the quieter. Now, turning around from the Bank Junction and heading up Cornhill, we'll see a lot more of these palaces of finance, these 19th century buildings, fine stone buildings, grand banking buildings reflecting the wealth of the companies which were drawing finance from the whole of the empire, of the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries. And we have a city with 2,000 years of history, but some of our history is actually quite new. And here's an example coming up in the center of the road. You see a statue on top of a stone plinth. Now, the person commemorated by the statue is James Henry Greathead. There's a plaque to him there, and the statue up above. And you can see from the fact that he's reading plans that he was an engineer. In fact, he was the man that invented the means of digging tunnels underneath London for the tube railway. He constructed the first tube railway from South London right into the Bank Junction in the heart of the city. And that was a great move forward because it allowed huge numbers of people to be moved around this big city and also enabled them to come to work in this central location. But although it might look it, this statue isn't old. Back in the 1990s, they were planning an extension of the new rapid transit system in the London Docklands area right into the center of the city. It's called the Docklands Light Railway. And in order to bring it into the station at Bank, they needed extra ventilation. And they wanted to build ventilation shafts in the middle of streets. But as you see, this is a very historic street surrounded by wonderful stone buildings. And as the city planner, I wasn't at all keen to have a modern engineering structure in the middle of the street, spoiling the historic environment. So the people who were planning the project said, don't worry, we have a good budget. We can redesign the ventilation shaft so it will look attractive. Perhaps you'd help us with the design. So my colleagues helped to design this classical structure that you see in front of you, just a stone base, and then a metal ventilation cap on the top, a perforated cap. Well, they produced the designs and they said to us, well, you must be very happy with that. That surely is what you want. And I said, well, you really can't put a stone plinth in the middle of the street. It looks like it ought to have a statue. And they said, but we don't want a statue. We don't need a statue. And I said, oh, well, if you want permission for your ventilation shaft, we'll have to have a statue. So I got to suggest that we had a statue to Mr. Greathead because it seemed appropriate as his first railway had terminated near this point. And anyway, with a little bit of arm twisting, we got our stone plinth, we got our statue to Mr. Greathead, and the railway company got their ventilation shaft. So you see, the job of a planner is one where you often have to achieve compromise and persuade people to do things, sometimes things they don't want to do, in order to balance things out. It's no good saying no, you've got to say yes, but. And in my 30 years as chief planner in the City of London, there were many examples like that. That's a relatively small one. There are others that we will see later relating to some of the skyscrapers in the cluster of towers. We'll talk more about those in a little while. Now, the City of London is, as I've said, all about business, and particularly financial business. So we have these major thoroughfares lined with grand 19th century buildings, and off them we have alleyways, little pedestrian routes running through the buildings. These routes enable pedestrians to get around the city very easily. They don't have to follow the streets to find their way from one meeting to the next. That makes the city very pedestrian friendly. It also makes it quite a surprising, secretive sort of place, a place that you have to learn. You have to learn the shortcuts. As we walk up Cornhill, just look at the contrast between, on the left, the Royal Exchange, London's first stock exchange, and rising behind them, the towers of the 21st century, the new city centre in the financial district, but contrasted with yet another small alleyway. Now, these alleyways were the places where in medieval times, and remember, underneath the modern city, there's a Roman city and a medieval city, 2,000 years of history underlying the fabric and dictating still very much the street plans of the city. But the medieval pubs were the centers of business. In fact, it was these pubs that were the start of the banking industry in the City of London. People would go to a pub in order to exchange news. They would meet their friends and colleagues, and as a result, these were the places where people started to carry out transactions. So it's not too surprising that today, banks very often have a logo or a sign based on an old pub sign. The Black Horse of Lloyds Bank, the Spread Eagle of Barclays. Now we're going to turn into one of these little alleyways. We see the sign for Simpson's Tavern, and of course that's an indication that there's a pub in this alleyway, and signs to other businesses at the entrance. And as we turn off the street, you can see we're turning into an incredibly narrow alleyway called Ball Court. And you might, if you didn't know where you were going, be a little bit worried about going down a small alley, a dark alleyway like this. But we're coming out into a really useful space in the city. This is one of the outdoor rooms of the city. You can see that we have Simpson's Tavern, a pub and restaurant, around two sides of the space. We have some barrels in the middle of the space, which allow people to put down their drinks when they're gossiping. And as you can see, with the group coming into the space, it's really quite small. It's a domestic sized room sort of space, but outdoors. We have the paving beneath our feet, the old stone, the York stone paving. You can see that up above, there's very little sky visible. Some of the later buildings are taller, but the space has sufficient intimacy to make it the sort of place where you'd want to come and meet your friends, your colleagues, your competitors. And so in a normal day when people are working in the city, this is the sort of place they might come at lunchtime to have a sandwich and some beer, and certainly to come in the evening to relax with their colleagues and to eavesdrop on the gossip of their competitors. Because you see, the City of London is just like a village. And small rural villages, everybody knows that if you want to find out what's going on in the village, you go down to the local pub or cafe or coffee bar, whatever it is, depending on your culture. That's the place you pick up the hot news. It doesn't come over the phone, it doesn't come down the wire to you. You've got to actually go and find people who can give you the latest news. It's exactly the same in this international financial center. People want the hottest gossip. And for proof of that, there's a man who's made a lot of money out of gossip, and he's called Mike Bloomberg. He used to be the mayor of New York, but he mainly runs Bloomberg, the international business media company. And they make their living out of collecting and transmitting business gossip. Now, when Bloomberg wanted a new European headquarters, where did he choose to build it? He chose to build it just a few hundred meters away from the bank junction, right in the center of the City of London. Because he knew if he wanted the hottest gossip, his people had to be out in these alleyways and streets, overhearing what's going on and picking up the latest news to take back and transmit around the world. So this might be a medieval concept of people going to pubs and doing their financial transactions inside the pubs. But even in the 21st century, the international business community is still linked to these old gossip networks. And it's very important as planners that one of the first things we need to recognize when we're looking at a place where we intend to make an intervention, we have to recognize where are the centers of gossip, because these nodes of gossip are very important to protect and also to encourage them to thrive. One way we can create a gossip node is to create a new space. Now, if you're going to create a new space, it shouldn't be a large space if it's going to be good for gossip. As I said, this space is about domestic room size. We came in down a little passageway behind the guys that are with us today, and we can exit on the other side down another even narrower passageway. So in other words, we could come into this space and pass through it without coming here for a purpose. But of course, in passing through the space on our way from one place to another, we might bump into people or overhear something that would be very useful to us. We can also pretend, of course, that we're not going to go to the pub to have a drink, that in fact, we're just on our way to another meeting. And then, oh dear, we get delayed on the way to the meeting. So the space is accessible, it's permeable, you can pass through it, it's of the right scale, and above all, it has the right mixture of uses. It has the use that can provide us with food and drink alongside the space, and that gives the space its vitality and a reason to visit it. So all of those things come together, and we've made, or at least in this case, we already have ready-made a good urban space, a great node for gossip. Okay, now let's pretend we didn't come for a drink, and let's pass out of the space down the other alleyway. And you can see this one's even darker and narrower, with a few beer barrels lining the sides of it. And we soon come out of the dark passageway into another alleyway that's better lit, where we see a few shops, we see a hairdresser's, and another set of bars. The one we're passing at the moment is quite famous. It's called the Georgian Vulture. And the Georgian Vulture is featured in Dickens' Pickwick Papers as the place that Mr. Pickwick and his friends used to meet to gossip. Well, where better to set it than the City of London? Because as even Dickens realized, that's what we are about here. We're about gossip and exchanging information. You see how this network of alleyways meet, some of them leading back out to Main Street, others going underneath buildings through into other spaces beyond. So we have this whole network, this sort of rabbit warren of passageways, which provide the shortcuts for people to get between meetings, and at the same time, get you away from streets and traffic and the noise and bustle. So it's almost like having two cities, one within another. The old medieval city, you might almost say the Harry Potter Diagon Alley city, and the modern 21st century city just a few steps away. That's a great combination. And there are very few places, if any, in the world where you have 2,000 years of history combined with a modern business center, all in the same place. In most cities, modern business centers have been shifted to the perimeter. At Canary Wharf, we have an option for an alternative city in London at Canary Wharf, in Paris at La Défense, at Pudong in Shanghai, various places around the world where there have been attempts to create international business centers, but they never work quite as well as when you can be downtown, close to the gossip. So let's carry on our walk through the alleyways, and we're coming up to some black iron railings on the left. In fact, these are not old railings, these are restoration of railings that were taken away many years ago and were only put back in the 20th century. But it's very important because they're enclosing a very nice green space. They're enclosing the churchyard of St. Peter Cornhill. And that provides a quiet space in the center of a very busy city, somewhere that people can come and sit quietly. The railing is very important because the railings separate that quiet green space around the church from the rather more vibrant space, at least quite often when there are people around, around the bars in these alleyways. So you'll have people outside the railings drinking their beer and perhaps talking, making a bit of noise, but just inside you have an oasis of calm. And sometimes it's very important for us to think about how we separate the different users of space. Not every activity fits well together in the same piece of space. And sometimes we do need to have this sort of segregation of people into the different activities to have calmer areas and more vibrant areas. And indeed areas like this alleyway where people can come and go from one place to another, passing through the space without actually stopping. So let's carry on with our walk. Here we have the rear door to a great banking hall of the City of London. And in fact, this banking hall has now been converted into a very large branch of Wetherspoons right in the heart of the city, the Cross Keys. So you can now enjoy the grandeur of the early 20th century architecture and interior of the banking hall, and at the same time have a pint at very economical prices. So you see what a mixture of elements we have here. We have a wren church tower after the Great Fire of London after 1666, a late 17th century church, surrounded by 19th century buildings, some 20th century office buildings built in reasonably sensitive materials, and then the backs of early Edwardian buildings, some stone and some white tile, because this wasn't the principal elevation of the building. All of the time when we are having buildings replaced in the city, we make attempts to get more pedestrian routes. And here's an extra link that was put in from the network of alleyways through into another little network beyond. It's very important in planning the city to keep it vibrant, to ensure that pedestrian routes are protected, and that in fact, wherever possible, we can join up the pedestrian routes and make even more of them. And here we've got a couple of examples of ways where we've taken service yards at the backs of buildings and connected them through with new walkways that take us from one small space to another. And here we're coming out into another churchyard of St. Michael's Cornhill, and beyond it, the cheese grater, one of the skyscrapers of the city. Now, this church has an interesting history, because when the church was rebuilt, the church was built slightly further forward or nearer to an adjoining building than the previous church had been. And so when the church was completed, and I'll cross the road to show you this. When the church was completed, you can just see the small entrance to the church tucked in there with the red door. And next to it, a building which was engulfed a little bit by the church. And so when they built the building, the owners of the building put a devil, you can see sticking out on the left-hand side of that building. That's the Cornhill Devil facing the church, to remind them that they were not very pleased about the development that had gone on with the church and the effect it had had on their building. So you see these little spats going on within this big international city, sometimes coming down to very small parochial issues. Now let's go back across again into these alleyways, and we're going to go through into a very fine 19th century structure, but just pause to take a look back down Cornhill towards the Bank Junction, and then back into our network of alleyways to take another shortcut. And this time we're going to speed up a little bit because we've seen this before. Yet another back door to a pub, another shortcut into a pub from the pedestrian network. The more secluded space of the churchyard, somewhere where people can sit quietly. And now coming back out into Gracechurch Street, one of the north-south streets through the City of London, another artery of the city. And here we are going to have to cross a road with some traffic, but much less traffic than you would have experienced only a few years ago. And of course, a lot less traffic because it's a COVID environment that we now occupy. Now we're coming into something really grand. We're entering Leadenhall Market. This is a 19th century food market built by the City of London Corporation. And it's now transformed quite dramatically. It is now, I suppose you would say, a food court for the City of London, where office workers can come at lunchtime and sit at tables and eat lunch and, of course, gossip. But looking up above the shops, you'll see on the front of the shops a lot of hooks. These were mostly butchers' shops and used to have meat hanging on them. And at Christmas time, you would see poultry like turkeys hanging on the front of these buildings. Well, it's very interesting because we have a cafe here that has traditional Spanish hams, and they've hung these Spanish hams on the outside of the building, very much in the style of the old tradition of the butchers that used to occupy this space. So you see how a modern experience is linking in with the old traditions. Some of you may think that this space that I'm walking through at the moment, Leadenhall Market, looks somewhat familiar. And that's not surprising because that view looking back down Leadenhall Market was one of the first scenes in the very first Harry Potter film, where Hagrid took Harry to Diagon Alley to buy the things he needed for going away to Hogwarts School. And Diagon Alley's entrance is in fact just off this street. You have to know just which of the bricks in which wall to press in order to get in. Now, although as former city planner, I'm in on the secret, I'm afraid I'm not allowed to share it with you. You see, there's no sort of literary reference that isn't useful. Even studying the films of Harry Potter and the books can teach you an awful lot about places and townscape, because Diagon Alley and the impressions of it capture a great deal of what we like about old places, about the vibrancy of a shopping street. And I think it's very appropriate that one of the modern artwork interventions that are around the city at the moment is a neon sign up above Leadenhall Market saying, "I'm staying." Well, I think that probably does sum up the spirit of the City of London, because once COVID is beaten, the city will still be here. The city will bounce back in the way that it did after the Black Death in the 14th century, when half the population died with the plague. After the plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of 1666, at that time, 80% of the city was destroyed by fire. The city bounced back again afterwards. And each time the city bounces back, it bounces back stronger, because it's a place of skills in business, a place where people gather to be amongst the most competitive people that they can meet, to do business with them. That's something that doesn't go away and doesn't evaporate simply because we've had a pandemic. Now, coming out of the 19th century Leadenhall Market, we're heading back into, or heading into, I should say, the 21st century, into the cluster of towers. I suppose that cluster started back in the mid-1980s with the construction of the Lloyd's building. Lloyd's of London is a centre of insurance, And Lloyd's of London came from a cafe. Lloyd's Cafe, Lloyd's Coffee House, was a place where people met in order to get deals to protect their precious cargoes that were being shipped around the world. And that coffee house, Lloyd's of London, became a financial institution, an insurance centre, which is now housed in this very 21st century, although in fact it's late 20th century, it looks 21st century, this fine modern building by Richard Rogers. Now, this building was under construction at the time that I took over as head of planning in the city. And a lot of people said to me, how on earth can permission be given? How on earth can planning permission be given for a building like that, an ultra modern building standing next to a wonderful old historic structure like Leadenhall Market? And Leadenhall Market is a building that has grade 2 protection as a heritage asset. Well, I think cities should be contrasted. I think you should have the new against the old. I think you do need a mixture of styles. And it's very interesting that less than 30 years after the Lloyd's building was built, that building is now a grade 1 heritage building. And so I sometimes say to people, why on earth would we allow Leadenhall Market to remain next to such a fine heritage building? As you can see, what is sometimes new and shocking at one stage can equally become part of the heritage later. The only constant in a place like the City of London is change. Now, although this is a very fine building, a very fine piece of architecture, when you look below the building, you can see that you end up with some quite gloomy spaces. So even some of the world's greatest architects like Richard Rogers can design a great architectural icon, a great monument to finance, something which shows you its workings on the outside with elevators on the outside of the building and escape stairs and services, producing a very interesting architectural form. But they're not always equally good at making the building connect with the ground or indeed connect with the adjoining buildings. And we have a really very gloomy space in between the pre-existing buildings and the Lloyd's building, and an even gloomier undercrop beneath the building. Okay, it is a December day, a particularly dark and grey day, but even in the summer, these spaces don't come alive as much as one would hope because of the way they're shielded underneath the building. So sometimes it's not just a case of designing good buildings, it's a case of how those buildings connect into the location where they're sited. And that, of course, is a primary role for the architect and the urban designer. I always said to developers that when they wish to do a development in the city, they should come to see me as chief planner at the back of the envelope stage, which is what we say when we want people to talk about a project from the very first moment. And I used to say, come to me at the back of the envelope stage, and please make sure your architect doesn't draw on the envelope first. And what I was saying was that I wanted the architect to sit down with the developer and the planner at the same time. You see, the developer has a brief for what they wish to build on the site. They know how much money they have to spend on the development. They know what the economics are. They know what uses they wish to incorporate into their building. But the planner equally has a brief because the planner has the knowledge about the locality and about the community. So if you can have a meeting at the start of a project where all three parties sit down together, then the planner can give the neighborhood brief, the developer can give the development brief, and then the architect can take both and sort out the conundrum of producing the appropriate building for the site. Very much a group activity. Development, planning, urban design is a matter of people working together in teams. And of course, everyone has to compromise. And talking of compromise, here we have a building with a polychromic top. The desire of the developers was to build a taller building than we would have liked on that particular site. I think we would probably have liked a building about that height. You see that where the stone stops. But as a result of negotiation, we achieved a public park on the roof of the building, and we allowed the building to go somewhat higher. But the building was designed to look as if it has two parts to it, the upper level floating over the level below. And of course, the color of the top of the building changes in the different light and at different times of day, producing something quite interesting. And also, we achieved another pedestrian route underneath the building. Now, we're surrounded by buildings by very famous architects, Richard Rogers with the Lloyd's building, Norman Foster here with the Willis building, Eric Parry with the 120 Leadenhall building, the park on the roof. And one of the ways that developers were able to achieve planning permission for these large buildings in the city, in a city which had traditionally been no more than 10 stories. In order to achieve skyscrapers, developers employed some of the world's greatest architects. So in changing the appearance of the city, it was very important that we didn't simply have larger buildings, but we actually had interesting buildings, buildings that would engage people's attention and would actually change the city's image. And the towers that I'm surrounded by now have certainly put the city back on the map as an international financial centre. Now, one of the things that has been triggered by this cluster of towers is the nicknaming buildings. And all of you, I'm sure, will have heard of the Gherkin, the building that started the whole of this cluster. Building where around the millennium, it was decided to replace a building that had been destroyed by terrorist bombing with a taller building. And there was a long discussion with Foster's, the architects, about how tall the building should be. The original proposal was 2.5 times the height of this one, and it frightened people. People didn't want buildings that tall. So after a lot of discussion and negotiation with the planners, we eventually ended up with a round building, a circular building, to put on the site. And at that point, I looked at it and I said, don't you think it ought to be thinner and taller? So having spent a couple of years fighting the height of the building, at the end, it was the planners who suggested that maybe it could be a little bit taller. So you could say that Foster's designed the Gherkin and I squeezed it. And which was instantly recognizable to people, and people fell in love with its unusual shape. It wasn't designed to be an icon on the skyline. It was designed for practical reasons, to be round in order to be kind to the wind and to minimize the impact of wind on the microclimate around the building. It was designed with that spiral twist in it to have atria that could funnel natural air through the building for ventilation purposes. It's smaller at the top to minimize its impact on the surroundings. And indeed, it's smaller at the bottom in order to maximize the amount of open space around the building. All of those are practical constraints, which led to a very unusual shape. Now, as soon as people saw that building, they started to change their mind about tall buildings, which up until then had not been popular in London. And so they said to me, where's the next one going to be? What does it look like? And what's its nickname? Well, the next building was going to be this one, the one that goes up to, it tapers up towards the top. And because I had seen a model of this building early on with its strange tapering shape, and at that time it had fins across the front elevation to reduce solar gain, I'd looked at that original model and I could imagine Lord Rogers' wife, Ruth Rogers, who is a famous chef, using a little object like that to grate the cheese onto the pasta. And so I said, it looks like a cheese grater. Well, my nickname stuck. And so this is one of the few buildings in the city that I actually nicknamed the cheese grater. But you can see that people wanting nicknames for buildings was an indication that they were actually rather liking these new shapes and new forms. They were identifying with them by nicknaming them. It's a little bit like when you go to school. You're not really accepted in a new school until you've got a nickname. It's the same in a regular pub that you go into. People get nicknames for in their local pub where they're well known. Now, planning gain from these buildings comes in many forms. Around the Gherkin, we achieved open space. With the cheese grater, the building was going to a point at the top, and so it wasn't possible to get a roof terrace, but it was possible to get them to take away the bottom 5 stories of the building and create space beneath the building. So we ended up with this public undercroft and also the re-landscaping of the space alongside the piazza. Now, turning around again, one of the latest tall buildings that's gone up is this building called the Scalpel. You see this one goes to a very sharp point at the top, which is how it got its nickname. And this was one of the few projects where the developers actually used their nickname in order to advertise their building to potential tenants. So even the developers are now starting to see how important it is to have an identity and a character to your building, and that they should all be different from one another. They should all have an individual personality, rather than the sort of cities you see in places like Canary Wharf and in many American cities, where all the buildings look very much the same. They're just boxes. So as we cross over the road, again, you can get a better view of this landscape piazza. Many people would say, oh, we're building big buildings, big skyscrapers. What we want to do is to make great piazzas around them, where people can see the front of the building. It's a very grand approach to the tall building, and people will be able to use these wonderful public spaces. But of course, this is a space on the corner of 2 streets, and you can see that the piazza is surrounded by what are normally very busy streets with traffic, a lot of movement and noise and bustle going on. So from my point of view, as having spent my years designing and planning in a place like the city, I don't regard this as good space because it leaks away. It's too big and it's too impacted by the surrounding environment, the negative environment of the city. So I prefer to have the little spaces we were walking through earlier, have collections of spaces that people can go to, which are away from the traffic, away from the main streets. I always say the best spaces are at the back, not at the front of a great building. So when you create space under a building, of course, you have another problem where you can end up having wind. The tall buildings attract downdrafts of wind, and it's very difficult to make an attractive environment. What you end up doing is having glass screens to protect people in order to calm the wind. So the outdoor space is sometimes better than one that is protected underneath the building. But as you can see, we're in very much a very different sort of city from the one that we were in earlier. We're no longer in a medieval city of little alleyways. We're in a modern 21st century city of towers. But still, the pedestrian connectivity, these pedestrian routes and smaller spaces are important. Everywhere you go in the city, you will see work underway. The areas being repaved, buildings being constructed and completed. And here at the Bishopsgate Building, 120 Bishopsgate, you can see one of the latest towers of the city, one that was approved after I ceased to be chief planner. I'm afraid it's not one of my favorites. I don't mind the height, but I do object to the width. It really is a massive, bulky building. But of course, the city needs space. Although people are saying that everything will change after COVID and people will work from home, I personally don't believe that to be true. I think people will be coming back to the big business centres. Okay, they will be working in a different way. They'll work some of the time from home, some of the time in the office, but people want to come to the office, especially the 20 and 30 somethings for whom the office is the centre of their social life. You see artwork in the middle of the city, these modern sculptures. It's a scheme that the City Corporation started some years ago, where we had realized that the artworks of some of the greatest 20th century artists were being bought by their artistic agents and then put into warehouses for storage until they realized their highest value at auction. And then they'd be bought by private collectors and would go into the homes or the vaults of these collectors and would really never be seen by the public. So we asked the art agents if these works couldn't be exhibited on the city streets. And they said, well, that's a crazy idea. Have you any idea how much it would cost to insure these valuable works? And we said, oh, that's easy. Leave that to us. So we went along to the people in this building. Hiscox are the world's largest art insurers. And we said to them, city planners would like to have art on the streets of the city. Would you be prepared to sponsor it? And they said, how much money do you want? And we said, we don't want any money. We just want you to insure the works of art. And they agreed. So there's an example of planners trying to be the middlemen and using ingenuity to make a difference in the environment. So we have a changing collection of works of art, which are changed each season, come out onto the streets of the city. People see things which would otherwise simply be hidden in warehouses. And we managed to fix the insurance for this for it to happen. But of course, the City of London is the centre of insurance. So we're better to be able to do that. Approaching the Gherkin, but as we do so, although it's difficult to see behind all these work vehicles, you can see the remains of a medieval church right in the middle of the city, surrounded by the ultra-modern buildings of the 21st century. You remember me saying earlier that some very great buildings are not quite so great in terms of their relationships to their surroundings. And I think that's another thing that one could say about the Gherkin. We have a circular building in a space surrounded by other buildings of less importance. In fact, most of the buildings surrounding the Gherkin, we're seeing side elevations that were never intended to be viewed. And that means that we have some less distinguished buildings around the space. We have the Gherkin in the middle of the space. And I remember at the time that the architects designed the building, they said, well, one of the virtues of our building and putting it in the center of the space and leaving space around the outside, this cookie cutter space, is that you'll get wonderful new views of an important heritage building, the building ahead of us, this green building. This is a building designed by the Dutch architect Berlacher. He designed the stock exchange in Amsterdam. That's probably his most famous building. But here we have a building called Holland House, appropriately because he was a Dutch architect. And Holland House was the headquarters of the Holland America Line, a shipping company. Now, it's very interesting to be able to stand in front of this building and look at it straight on like this. You can see it's a building that's covered in clay panels. So it was a building that was easy to keep clean. It could be washed down when they washed down the windows. And it was a building that was sitting in a narrow side street in the city. This part of the city was the center not only of insurance, but also of shipping. And a lot of people said, oh, well, you know, it's very good to be able to have this new view of this building. It was a very innovative office building at the time. It's by a famous architect. So it's rather nice that the Gherkin is set back and leaves space all around it so we can look across and appreciate this old building. But this is really a very ordinary view of a fine building. And if you just walk down the street with me, we'll get a view as the building was meant to be seen. So we have a narrow street which would have ended just to the right of this camera view where the bollards are lined up. And when we get to the end of the street, we'll turn back and look back up the street at the building by Berlacher, Holland House. And now you see a building where there are no apparent windows. It looks like it's just sculpted out of a block of stone. And that was how the architect imagined his building would be seen. That's how he designed it to be seen along a narrow side street with the front of the building set in bays to produce this very solid, dramatic appearance. So you see, opening it up by setting back the Gherkin in the middle of its cookie cutter space isn't necessarily doing the best thing for the surrounding buildings or the setting. So more space isn't necessarily better space. Having said that, you can forgive a lot when you have a building of this quality, where the detailing is so fine and the structure is so innovative, and a building which recast the image of the City of London in the insurance industry and indeed the city's role in the world. At the other end of the street, we go back into 19th century mode with tea warehouses, which are now converted into residential apartments. But as we come along this street, although the corner building is not particularly distinguished, we saw Holland House, this corner building left behind previous to the development of Holland House. But Holland House gets one more hooray, because there's another little bit of it here in this adjoining street. And if we can get around the back of this grey delivery van, you'll see the surprise that Holland House has to offer us. Because here on the corner, a lovely little landmark, the bow of a ship indicating the use of the building, the Holland America line, the shipping industry being marked by this sculpture set into the corner of the building. And it's little details like that that give so much of the flavor of a place. It's not just the grand tall buildings, it's the details, the fact that you can go up to a building and appreciate its shape, actually reach out and touch it. It almost makes you want to stroke the building. And that's something I encourage you all to do, that when you're going around places, don't just look at them, smell them, touch them. I'm not going to suggest tasting them, that's probably unhealthy, but use all your senses is what I'm saying, because it's very important that in learning about a place, you expose yourself to the place and you really understand it with all your senses. So once more, around the corner, towers, 19th century palaces to finance and to shipping, and pedestrian routes with spaces. And I don't think there'd be any better place to finish than to finish with this message, where we see the sculpture ahead of us, this neon sculpture, the same for everyone. Well, I think as planners, we have to be very careful that we don't imagine that places are like that. Places are not the same for everyone. Everyone has a different impression of a place. Everyone looks at places in different ways, uses places in different ways. And our skill as urban designers and planners is to be able to ensure that we have as much variety, as much scope for individuality in the users as possible when we intervene in places. So we need spaces that are not the same for everyone. We need places that offer great scope for everyone to be different and to be themselves. And I don't think I can sum up the walk better than by challenging this statement, the same for everyone. Now, we've had about an hour's walk around the City of London. It's been a great pleasure for me to share what I still call my city with all of you. And I hope you've enjoyed the walk. I hope this experiment has been successful. I hope that maybe we'll be able to continue these virtual walks for some of you, real walks for the others. And you can see we're all socially distanced. Well, some of us are in pods and bubbles, but most of us are socially distanced. And we've come out with great strength of character on this very cold morning to walk around the city. So thanks very much for all of you who've actually come out with me. Thanks especially to my intrepid camera crew who've been getting cold with me and allowing us to send the pictures that you've been seeing of the walk. I hope the split screen format is a success. Please let Pablo have your comments on what we've been doing today, because it'd be very useful for us to know how successful this technique is. It's something that's very much a first in terms of what we've done. And just to end up, I'll just show you that I am still here and go back to my vlogging mode for the finish. So once again, thank you all very much for joining us. This walk has been recorded, so you'll be able to come back to it and see it online. But now from the City of London, it's goodbye and keep warm.